In the quiet corners of a bustling city, where the pulse of life often drowns out the voices that matter most, there lived a woman whose life would soon intersect with something far bigger than herself. Her name was Maya Johnson, and her story is one that would challenge everything we think we know about courage, justice, and what it truly means to stand up for what's right. But before she became the hero we all needed, she was just another face in the crowd, navigating life's many challenges like so many others. Little did anyone know, Maya's world was about to shatter in a way that would forever change her, and the lives of countless others. It started on an ordinary morning, like so many others before it. Maya was walking down the street, minding her own business, when she witnessed an incident that would spark a fire she could never extinguish. A black man was being harassed by the police, something that, unfortunately, was not new to her. But this time, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, the kind you could almost taste. She had seen the headlines, heard the stories, and felt the rage that seemed to boil over every time something like this happened. But when she saw the young man's fear in his eyes, when she saw the way the officers treated him with an unjustified hostility, it hit her like a lightning bolt. This was more than just a case of police brutality. This was about power, control, and a system that had been built to keep people like her down. The realization was like a gut punch. Maya had always been an advocate for justice, speaking out in small ways, attending protests, sharing her voice on social media. But what she was witnessing right in front of her was no longer something she could passively watch. This was her moment, her test. She couldn't stand by and let this man suffer alone, not while the world turned a blind eye. In the midst of this chaotic scene, Maya's feet seemed to move without her thinking, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped forward, words of protest forming on her lips, and before she knew it, she was standing between the man and the officers, her body a shield. The world seemed to pause for a brief moment, the chaos around her slowing down. In that instant, she knew that her decision to speak out, to confront the injustice head-on, was no longer just a choice. It was a call to action. What happened next would haunt her for days, weeks, even months. She didn't know it at the time, but that moment would alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. The officers, shocked by her sudden intervention, became more aggressive, their threats growing louder. Maya felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't just facing an unjust system anymore. She was up against the very forces that had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. But Maya didn't back down. With every ounce of her strength, she stood her ground. The young man, now freed from the officer's grip, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. And in that brief exchange of looks, Maya felt something she had never truly felt before. A sense of power that came from knowing she had done the right thing. Her actions did not go unnoticed. Within hours, the footage of her brave stand went viral. People across the country, from every corner of the nation, were talking about the woman who had dared to face down the police. Some called her a hero, others a troublemaker, but Maya knew that none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had started a conversation about police brutality, racial injustice, and the need for change. But just as quickly as the world celebrated her, the forces that had been put in motion began to push back. She was contacted by community leaders, civil rights activists, and even lawyers offering their support. But she was also met with threats. Her phone rang with hate-filled messages. Her social media accounts were flooded with accusations and calls for her to be silenced. The fear that had once been a distant, abstract concept was now staring her in the face. Would she back down? Would she let fear dictate her next steps? Or would she rise up once again? Maya knew that she had crossed a line, but what she didn't know was how far the line would stretch, or how much she was willing to sacrifice in order to stand firm in her beliefs. This was only the beginning, and the road ahead. was fraught with dangers. Would she be able to withstand the pressure and continue her fight? Or would the weight of the consequences crush her under its force? As the story unfolds, the question on everyone's mind is simple. How far would Maya go to bring justice to a system that had never cared for people like her? Her journey was just beginning, and the world was watching, waiting to see if she would emerge victorious, or if she would fall prey to the very system she was trying to dismantle. What Maya didn't realize was that she was no longer just fighting for one man, one instance of injustice. She was now fighting for a movement, a cause, and a future where the world could no longer turn a blind eye. But as she stood on the precipice of her destiny, she had no way of knowing that the hardest battles were yet to come. The question remained: could she handle what was about to happen next? Stay tuned for the next part of Maya's story, where the true cost of standing up against injustice will be revealed, along with a surprising twist that no one saw coming. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Maya. What had started as a spontaneous act of defiance had quickly spiraled into something far more complicated. The footage of her standing between the officers and the young man had been shared thousands of times, each click adding to the growing firestorm around her. It was a fire she hadn't asked for, yet it was one she now couldn't escape. The calls and messages began almost immediately. Her phone buzzed constantly. Some messages were filled with praise and admiration, others with anger and vitriol. Strangers thanked her for her bravery, while others hurled insults and threats, daring her to take one more step. Maya had never experienced anything like it. In the past, she'd quietly participated in protests and discussions, lending her voice to the cause of racial justice when she could. But this was different. This was a personal attack, a fight for something bigger than just her. She couldn't escape the noise. Her friends, her family, even her coworkers had all reached out, offering both congratulations and caution. Some urged her to lay low, to stop posting on social media, to avoid drawing any more attention to herself. But Maya couldn't ignore the pull inside her. The fight that had sparked that fateful morning wasn't over, it had only just begun. And she wasn't about to turn her back now. Yet, as much as she tried to focus on the larger picture, there were moments when the weight of the situation became overwhelming. Late at night, she'd lie awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Could she really keep this up? She had a job, friends, a life that was now constantly under threat. There were things she had worked so hard for, things she might lose if this went too far. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the realization that, with every decision she made, she was stepping deeper into a battle she had no way of fully understanding. The local news had picked up the story, and the footage of her standing in front of the officers was replayed over and over. Some people viewed her as a hero. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds resonated with so many who had seen similar injustices unfold and done nothing. But others, especially those who had long defended law enforcement's practices, labeled her a troublemaker. They questioned her motives, casting doubt on her character, trying to twist the narrative into something she wasn't. Maya felt the pressure. With every passing day, the story evolved, becoming something larger than she could have ever imagined. Activists from across the country reached out to her, offering advice, support, and resources. Lawyers began contacting her, urging her to consider taking legal action against the officers involved, even though she hadn't suffered any physical harm. But it wasn't about the officers. It wasn't about the fear she felt standing in front of them. It was about the system that had allowed this to happen over and over again. Yet as much as she wanted to keep fighting, as much as she wanted to amplify the message, the stakes had grown higher. The threats against her were no longer just online insults or hateful messages. They were real. A few days after the video went viral, she received a call from a woman who claimed to be a friend of one of. Was fraught with dangers. Would she be able to withstand the pressure and continue her fight? Or would the weight of the consequences crush her under its force? As the story unfolds, the question on everyone's mind is simple. How far would Maya go to bring justice to a system that had never cared for people like her? Her journey was just beginning, and the world was watching, waiting to see if she would emerge victorious, or if she would fall prey to the very system she was trying to dismantle. What Maya didn't realize was that she was no longer just fighting for one man, one instance of injustice. She was now fighting for a movement, a cause, and a future where the world could no longer turn a blind eye. But as she stood on the precipice of her destiny, she had no way of knowing that the hardest battles were yet to come. The question remained: could she handle what was about to happen next? Stay tuned for the next part of Maya's story, where the true cost of standing up against injustice will be revealed, along with a surprising twist that no one saw coming. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Maya. What had started as a spontaneous act of defiance had quickly spiraled into something far more complicated. The footage of her standing between the officers and the young man had been shared thousands of times, each click adding to the growing firestorm around her. It was a fire she hadn't asked for, yet it was one she now couldn't escape. The calls and messages began almost immediately. Her phone buzzed constantly. Some messages were filled with praise and admiration, others with anger and vitriol. Strangers thanked her for her bravery, while others hurled insults and threats, daring her to take one more step. Maya had never experienced anything like it. In the past, she'd quietly participated in protests and discussions, lending her voice to the cause of racial justice when she could. But this was different. This was a personal attack, a fight for something bigger than just her. She couldn't escape the noise. Her friends, her family, even her coworkers had all reached out, offering both congratulations and caution. Some urged her to lay low, to stop posting on social media, to avoid drawing any more attention to herself. But Maya couldn't ignore the pull inside her. The fight that had sparked that fateful morning wasn't over, it had only just begun. And she wasn't about to turn her back now. Yet, as much as she tried to focus on the larger picture, there were moments when the weight of the situation became overwhelming. Late at night, she'd lie awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Could she really keep this up? She had a job, friends, a life that was now constantly under threat. There were things she had worked so hard for, things she might lose if this went too far. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the realization that, with every decision she made, she was stepping deeper into a battle she had no way of fully understanding. The local news had picked up the story, and the footage of her standing in front of the officers was replayed over and over. Some people viewed her as a hero. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds resonated with so many who had seen similar injustices unfold and done nothing. But others, especially those who had long defended law enforcement's practices, labeled her a troublemaker. They questioned her motives, casting doubt on her character, trying to twist the narrative into something she wasn't. Maya felt the pressure. With every passing day, the story evolved, becoming something larger than she could have ever imagined. Activists from across the country reached out to her, offering advice, support, and resources. Lawyers began contacting her, urging her to consider taking legal action against the officers involved, even though she hadn't suffered any physical harm. But it wasn't about the officers. It wasn't about the fear she felt standing in front of them. It was about the system that had allowed this to happen over and over again. Yet as much as she wanted to keep fighting, as much as she wanted to amplify the message, the stakes had grown higher. The threats against her were no longer just online insults or hateful messages. They were real. A few days after the video went viral, she received a call from a woman who claimed to be a friend of one of the officers involved in the incident. The woman warned her to back off, to leave the situation alone before it escalated any further. Her voice was cold, detached, and filled with a sense of finality. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said before abruptly hanging up. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated just how deep the roots of this problem went. But what could she do? She couldn't just let them intimidate her into silence. She had stood up for what was right, and she wasn't about to back down now. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she knew about the larger forces at play. Yes, there were individual officers who had acted inappropriately. But the system that allowed them to operate with impunity was much bigger than just a few bad actors. It was a system built on years, decades, even, of policies and practices designed to maintain control, to suppress those who dared to challenge the status quo. And Maya, without fully realizing it, had become the face of that challenge. She started digging deeper into the story, talking to local activists, attending meetings, trying to learn as much as she could about the systemic issues surrounding police brutality. The more she learned, the more disgusted she became by the web of corruption, apathy, and silence that held everything together. What she had thought was a straightforward case of injustice was only the tip of the iceberg. The real battle was one of power, of dismantling the structures that had allowed this to happen for so long. And Maya was just beginning to understand how much was at stake. One evening, after a long day of meeting with organizers, Maya sat down at her kitchen table, exhausted. Her phone rang, and she didn't even look at the screen before answering. It was the sound of a familiar voice, her mother's. "Baby, are you okay?" her mother asked, her voice filled with concern. Maya sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "I don't know, Mom. I feel like I'm in over my head." Her mother paused for a moment, then spoke softly. "I know this is hard, and I know you want to make a difference. But be careful. You're going up against something bigger than you, bigger than any one person can take on alone." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to disappoint her mother, but she couldn't ignore the sense of purpose that had awakened in her. She knew that what she was doing was right, even if the cost was higher than she'd ever imagined. As the days wore on, the pressure only mounted. Maya found herself caught in a constant tug-of-war between her growing sense of responsibility and the mounting risks that came with it. She began to receive messages from strangers who were experiencing the same things she had witnessed that day: brutal encounters with law enforcement, harassment, and abuse. And though Maya knew the risks of becoming too involved, she also understood that she couldn't just walk away now. But she couldn't shake the growing feeling that someone was watching her. It was in the way she would glance over her shoulder when walking to her car, or the strange number that would show up on her phone without ever leaving a voicemail. Someone was out there, keeping track of her every move. Maya had no proof, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that the system she was challenging had its eyes on her, and would stop at nothing to shut her down. And just when she thought things couldn't get any more complicated, she received a cryptic message. It was simple, yet chilling. "We know who you are, and we know what you're doing. Keep going, and you'll regret it." Maya felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The stakes had just gotten even higher. But for better or worse, she knew she couldn't turn back now. The fight had only just begun, and Maya was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than just the threats and the pressure she had already faced. She had always known that standing up against a system like this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated how deep the roots of this fight ran. It wasn't just about the police officers involved that day, or even about the specific incident with the young man. It was about a much larger, more insidious force. The system that allowed police brutality to thrive wasn't just a matter of bad apples. It was an entire structure designed to uphold power and control, and the deeper Maya dug into it, the more she realized how little she knew. Her conversations with activists, lawyers, and community leaders revealed things she hadn't even considered: systems of influence, corruption within local governments, and law enforcement officers who had ties to groups that Maya had only heard about in the news. These weren't just isolated incidents. These were part of a pattern, a cycle of violence and injustice that stretched far beyond her own city. The more she uncovered, the more overwhelming the fight seemed. There were people who had been working for years to expose these injustices, yet they too had faced setbacks, silencing attempts, and intimidation. Maya was now standing on the same front lines, but it was clear that the war she had unwittingly joined was far more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. As the days wore on, Maya's personal life began to unravel. She hadn't heard from her friends as much. Her phone was flooded with notifications, but many of the people she had once considered close had begun to distance themselves from her. Some were worried for her safety, advising her to keep a low profile. Others, whose voices she had once heard loud and clear during protests and meetings, now seemed silent, afraid to associate with the growing storm of controversy surrounding Maya. Even the media, which had initially praised her bravery, started shifting its tone. Reporters began questioning her motivations, asking whether her actions were more about self-promotion than true justice. There were whispers of a dangerous radical label starting to form around her. One morning, Maya received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist named Carter, someone who had been covering the rising tension between communities and law enforcement in her city. He wanted to meet. She didn't trust him completely, but something in his tone told her he wasn't just another reporter looking to spin her story for clicks. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. When she walked into the cafe, Carter was already sitting at a corner table, his notebook and camera in front of him. He gave her a polite nod as she sat down. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. There was a sense of understanding in the air, like they both knew they were standing on a precipice, just waiting for something to tip the balance. After a few moments of small talk, Carter leaned in. "I'm sure you've heard the rumors," he began, his voice low. "People are starting to dig into your background, Maya. And I don't think it's just about you standing up to the police. There's something bigger here. Something deeper." Maya's stomach tightened. She had suspected this for a while. The way things were starting to feel like they were spiraling into a situation that was no longer just about the incident with the officers. She had become a symbol, but symbols were targets. Carter's next words confirmed her worst fears. "There's a larger group behind this. They've been watching you since that day, and they've got plans to use your situation to fuel something much bigger. They want this to go viral, but not for the reasons you think. They don't want you as the hero, Maya, they want you as a martyr." The word struck her like a punch to the gut. Martyr? She wasn't fighting to be a symbol of suffering. She was fighting for justice, for change, for those who had been silenced for too long. But now, it seemed like the game was changing. The stakes had been raised, and she was being played. "They'll stop at nothing to control this narrative," Carter continued. "You've been part of their plan from the start, whether you realize it or not. They want to escalate things, make it bigger, make it messier. They want more people involved. And once that happens, they'll be able to control the outcome. If you're not careful, you could end up as just another casualty." Maya's mind raced as she processed everything Carter had just said. Was he trying to scare her? Or was he telling her the truth? She wasn't sure anymore. What she did know was that she had to be careful. There were forces out there, forces much bigger than she had ever imagined, that had an agenda of their own, and she was now a pawn in a game she barely understood. As she left the cafe, her thoughts were a tangled mess. She couldn't go back to her quiet life. She knew that, but she also couldn't afford to be manipulated. If this was part of a larger plan, Maya had to figure out how to control the narrative herself, or risk losing everything. The tension in the city was palpable. Protests had grown in size, and the police response was becoming increasingly aggressive. There were rumors of undercover officers infiltrating the crowds, stirring up violence to justify further crackdowns. Maya had been attending many of the protests, speaking to people who had been directly affected by police violence. She saw the same fear and anger in their eyes, the same emotions she had felt that day when she stepped into the street to confront the officers. But now, the protests had become a powder keg, ready to explode. And it wasn't just the police Maya had to worry about. There were people from within her own community who didn't agree with her approach, who thought she was making things worse. They had their own ideas about how change could be achieved, ideas that didn't always align with the path Maya had chosen. Some believed she was bringing unwanted attention to the cause, and others feared the backlash would only fuel the fire of more division. Even the activists who had once supported her began to divide into factions, each group with its own vision for how to dismantle the system that oppressed them. Maya was caught in the middle, unable to escape the growing rift. She needed allies, but every person she turned to seemed to have their own agenda. The more she reached out for support, the more she realized how alone she really was in this fight. No one had all the answers. No one knew how to fix a system that was so deeply entrenched in power. The truth was, they were all just trying to survive in a world that was increasingly hostile to those who spoke out. As the days went on, the tension continued to build. Maya had become the center of attention, but not in the way she had hoped. She was no longer just a young woman standing up against an unjust system. She was now the face of a movement, a symbol of resistance, and a target for anyone who wanted to silence that resistance. And with each passing moment, the conflict grew deeper, darker, and more dangerous. What would she do next? What would be the cost of her next step? Only time would tell. But Maya knew one thing for certain: she couldn't stop now. The fight was bigger than her, bigger than any one person could bear. But she had no choice. She had already crossed the line. And there was no turning back. Maya couldn't escape the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The weight of her decisions was beginning to crush her. She had thought that by speaking out, by standing in the face of injustice, she was doing the right thing. But now, the pressure was unrelenting. The media continued to push the narrative, twisting her words and actions into something they weren't. The public, once supportive, was becoming divided. Some saw her as a hero, others, a threat to the peace. But as the days passed, the lines between right and wrong started to blur. She was no longer just fighting for justice, she was fighting for survival. The protests had grown more intense. What started as peaceful demonstrations had turned into heated clashes between the police and protesters. The sound of sirens and the flash of lights had become the backdrop of Maya's life. She could feel the tension in the streets, in the air, electric and volatile. The city was on the brink, and every step she took seemed to inch them closer to the edge. The authorities were tightening their grip. It wasn't just the police anymore. Maya had started to see officers in plain clothes, spies, informants, working within the crowds, stirring up trouble where there had been none. It felt like she was being hunted, that there were eyes everywhere, tracking her every move. Yet, it wasn't just the police she had to worry about. She'd begun to receive messages from within her own community. Messages from people who had supported her, but now viewed her as a liability. They warned her to be careful, to step back before things got worse. The last thing they wanted was for her to become the face of a movement that was beginning to fracture. There were those who believed she was taking the wrong approach, putting everyone at risk. They thought the protests were too visible, too dangerous, too much of a flashpoint. Maya was torn. She had no idea who to trust anymore. She wasn't sure if anyone was genuinely looking out for her, or if they all had their own hidden motives. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya received a message that made her heart stop. It was a simple text, with no name attached. Asterisk. You're going to regret this. The message wasn't even a threat, it was a promise. A cold, calculated warning. It was the same kind of message she had received before, but this time, it felt different. More real, more imminent. Her pulse quickened as her thoughts raced. Was this a warning from someone connected to the police, or from someone within the movement itself? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were escalating, and it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. The following day, she attended a protest at the heart of the city, a mass gathering where thousands of people had gathered to demand change. The air was thick with chants, with people holding signs, their faces full of determination. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were more officers stationed around the perimeter than she had seen before. Their presence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. And there were whispers among the protesters, rumors of undercover agents embedded within the crowd, trying to stir violence, trying to turn the peaceful demonstration into chaos. Maya tried to stay focused, tried to keep her mind on the reason she was there. But the anxiety in the air was palpable. It felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. And then, it did. A group of officers moved in, pushing forward with their shields raised, forcing people back. The crowd erupted into chaos. People were shouting, running in every direction. Some were crying out for peace, others were calling for an end to the violence. Maya's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, trying to make sense of what was happening. She saw one of the protesters, someone she recognized, being dragged away by police, their face a mask of terror. Without thinking, Maya rushed forward, determined to help. But as she got closer, something stopped her in her tracks. There, standing at the edge of the crowd, was a figure she hadn't expected to see, Carter. The journalist who had warned her about becoming a martyr. He was holding a camera, his expression cold and distant, watching everything unfold through the lens. Maya's stomach churned. Had he been part of this? Was he part of the plan to escalate things? She approached him, her voice tight with suspicion. "What are you doing here, Carter?" He didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the scene before them. Finally, he lowered the camera and turned to her. "This is bigger than you, Maya. You need to understand that." The words hit her like a slap. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers. But before she could speak, there was a sudden, deafening sound, a gunshot. Chaos erupted. In an instant, the peaceful protest became a war zone. Police rushed the crowd, swinging batons, firing rubber bullets, and using tear gas. The sound of shouting, screaming, and running footsteps filled the air. Maya's heart raced as she ducked behind a barricade, her mind spinning. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This was something else, something bigger. The violence was no accident. It was orchestrated. She looked back at Carter, whose eyes were wide with shock. "This was never just about you," he said again, his voice almost drowned out by the noise. "You were just the spark. They wanted this. Wanted it to escalate so they could crack down harder." They needed a reason to do it. And you gave it to them. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Carter's words were starting to sink in, but the truth was too much to grasp. The protests, the police violence, the escalating tensions, it was all part of a much larger plan. And she had walked right into it. The crowd was panicking. People were pushing, shoving, trying to get away from the police who were closing in on them. Maya's thoughts raced, but she couldn't think straight. She had to get out, had to find a way to escape before things got worse. But just as she turned to leave, a strong hand grabbed her arm. She spun around to face the person holding her, another officer, this time in plain clothes. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Maya froze, the realization sinking in. She had walked into the middle of a trap. The officer was trying to take her away, but she wasn't sure if he was there to help, or to silence her. Her heart pounded as she fought back, but the officer's grip tightened. "We're not going to hurt you," he said. "But you need to come with us. Now." Maya's mind raced as she made her decision. She had to get answers. She had to know the truth about everything, the violence, the people behind it, the larger forces at play. But would following this officer lead her closer to the answers, or deeper into the heart of the danger she had already found herself in? The crowd was still in chaos, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Maya was faced with a choice. Go with the officer and risk everything, or stay in the crowd, where the chaos seemed to be getting worse by the second. Either way, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Maya's heart raced as she stood there, locked in a moment of indecision, torn between the officer's grip and the chaos unfolding all around her. She could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. The streets were alive with fear, police sirens echoed, voices screamed, and the stench of tear gas hung in the air like a warning. Her instincts told her to run, to escape, but there was something else, a deeper, more dangerous pull, telling her to stay. To find out the truth, no matter the cost. Just as she was about to make up her mind, everything changed in an instant. The officer's grip on her arm tightened, but before she could react, a flash of movement caught her eye. A figure from the crowd, a woman she had seen before at the protests, broke through the sea of people and rushed toward her. It happened so fast, too fast for Maya to process, but in the split second that followed, she realized the woman wasn't running toward her. She was running at her. In that instant, the officer released his grip and turned, his eyes locked on the approaching figure. Maya didn't have time to react before the woman, with surprising strength, shoved the officer aside and grabbed Maya's hand. "We don't have much time," the woman whispered urgently. "Come with me." Maya didn't know who this woman was or why she had intervened, but something about her presence felt like a lifeline. Without thinking, she let herself be pulled through the crowd, away from the chaos, down an alley, and into a darkened building. The woman moved with purpose, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Maya could hardly catch her breath, but she didn't dare question her. The sound of the protest faded into the distance, replaced by the echo of their footsteps against the concrete walls. Once inside, the woman slammed the door shut behind them and locked it. Only then did she speak, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "You're in deeper than you realize, Maya. You've been targeted, and now it's getting dangerous. But there's more you don't know, much more." Maya blinked, trying to process the sudden change in direction. The tension in her chest had only grown worse since she had been pulled from the street. "What do you mean? Who are you? What's going on? And why did you help me?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one had followed them into the building. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "I'm someone who's been watching this unfold from the beginning. The protests, the police violence, it's all part of a much bigger operation. An operation you've unknowingly become a part of." Maya's mind spun. She didn't know whether to trust this woman, but the sense of impending danger was so real it felt like the walls around her were closing in. "The officer who grabbed you," the woman continued, her tone sharp. "He wasn't just any cop. He's part of the faction running this whole thing. This isn't just about police brutality, Maya. This is about control, manipulation, and orchestrating a movement for their own benefit. And the thing is, they're using you to get what they want." Maya felt her stomach drop. "Using me? I'm not part of any. What do you mean by that?" The woman shook her head. "You don't understand yet. The escalation at the protest, the violence, it's all been planned. But here's the twist. The people behind this, they want you to be the face of the resistance. They want you to be their rallying point, but they're setting you up for something bigger. Something far more dangerous. And when the time is right, they'll turn everything against you. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She was still trying to make sense of it, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way she hadn't imagined. There had been too many strange things happening, too many coincidences. The way the media had latched onto her story so quickly. The way the police had responded with more force than necessary. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a game with stakes higher than she had ever realized. But why me? Maya asked, her voice trembling. Why are they targeting me? I just wanted to stand up for what's right. The woman's eyes softened, but there was little comfort in her gaze. Because you're a symbol, Maya. You represent something powerful. They know if they can control you, control the narrative, you'll help them create the chaos they need. And when it all falls apart, they'll blame you. You'll become the villain in the story, but they'll paint it as if you were the hero turned traitor. Maya felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The air around her seemed to close in, pressing on her chest. Every instinct told her to run, to escape this twisted nightmare, but where could she go? How could she fight something this big, this deep? I've been following you for weeks, the woman said, pulling Maya from her thoughts. I knew something wasn't right. You're not just fighting police brutality, Maya. You're fighting an entire system that's been rigged against you from the start. I'm part of a group who's been trying to expose them for years, but we've been kept in the shadows. Now it's your turn to fight, but you need to know, there's a line you can't cross. Once you step over it, there's no coming back. Maya's pulse raced as her mind tried to keep up with the rapid twists. What line? What are you talking about? The woman's expression hardened. There's someone you need to meet. Someone who can help you figure this out, but they won't trust you unless you prove you're willing to go all in. It's a risk, but right now, it's your only shot. Maya's stomach churned with dread and uncertainty. The weight of her choices was heavier than ever. But the woman wasn't done. They're moving quickly. You don't have much time before things spiral out of control. And trust me, Maya, this doesn't just end with you being the face of a protest. They've set a trap. You're already in it. Her words echoed in Maya's mind as she tried to process it all. The protests, the police, the media, everything had been orchestrated, and she had been unknowingly pulled into the middle of it. But why? And who could she trust now? As the woman began to open the door, Maya's thoughts were a whirl of questions. Was this woman telling the truth? Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? And what was her next move? She had no answers, only the overwhelming sense that everything was about to escalate in a way she couldn't control. But there was one thing Maya knew for sure. She was about to step into the lion's den. And no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. Maya's heart pounded as the woman led her through the dark corridors of the building. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. The tension in the air was suffocating, but there was no turning back now. The woman had spoken of a person Maya needed to meet, someone who could provide the answers she so desperately sought. But the deeper they went into the building, the more the gnawing feeling in Maya's gut intensified. She could sense that whatever was waiting ahead was going to be bigger, more dangerous than anything she had faced so far. The woman stopped in front of a heavy steel door and turned to face Maya. This is it, she said, her voice low. What happens next is up to you. Maya swallowed hard. She had no idea what she was about to walk into, but she had come too far to back down now. With a nod, she pushed open the door, and what she saw inside took her breath away. The room was filled with monitors, dozens of them, all showing live footage of various protests, police stations, and even the streets outside the building. It was a control room, but it wasn't just any control room. It was a hub for orchestrating the chaos she had been caught up in. At the center of the room stood a man, his back to her, watching the screens with cold, calculated eyes. He turned slowly, and Maya's breath caught when she saw his face. It was Carter, the same journalist who had warned her, who had seemed so sincere in his desire to protect her, was now standing in front of her as the mastermind behind it all. Maya took a step back, her mind reeling. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now, standing in this room, the truth was undeniable. What is this? Maya demanded, her voice shaking with disbelief. What's going on, Carter? He didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze with a look that was both familiar and distant, as if the person she had once known was no longer standing before her. I never wanted you to get involved in all this, he said quietly. But you were too valuable a piece to ignore. Maya's eyes widened. What do you mean, valuable? You used me. You manipulated me. Carter's expression softened, but only for a moment. I didn't manipulate you. I just gave you the push you needed. You've always been the catalyst, Maya. You were never just a protester. You were a symbol. And symbols have power. Maya's chest tightened. She couldn't believe it. Carter had played her from the beginning, using her image, her voice, to fuel the fire. But why? Why had he done it? Why had he led her down this path? I didn't want to see you destroyed, he continued, his voice tinged with regret. I thought you could be the face of a movement that would shift the narrative, force the world to see the truth. But in the end, this whole thing wasn't about justice. It was about control. Maya took a step forward, her fists clenched. And the police? The violence? Was that part of your plan too? Did you use me to escalate everything, to give them the reason they needed to crack down? Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to one of the monitors and gestured to the footage of the protests outside. The scene was a brutal one, police in riot gear, the crowd growing increasingly agitated. Do you see it? He asked quietly. The violence was always going to happen, Maya. It's what they wanted, and you were the spark. But now, he trailed off, his voice heavy with unspoken words. Maya's stomach churned as she realized the full extent of what had been happening. The violence, the media frenzy, the protests, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. But who were they Carter was talking about? And where did she fit into the picture? Before she could voice her questions, the door to the control room slammed open, and a group of men in suits walked in, their presence instantly chilling. The woman who had brought Maya here stepped aside, her face unreadable. The men didn't acknowledge her, they only focused on Carter. Everything is in place, one of them said, his voice cold and professional. The narrative has shifted. It's time to push forward. Maya's mind raced. She had been right. There was something much larger at play here. Carter wasn't just part of a movement. He was a puppet master, working with powerful forces who had their own agenda. She had been nothing but a pawn in their game. But why had he gone to such lengths? What were they trying to accomplish? You're too late, Carter said suddenly, his voice sharper now. The pieces are already in motion. She's already made her mark. Now, we let the world decide. Maya's eyes widened. The pieces were in motion? What did that mean? Before she could process it, one of the men turned to face her. His gaze was cold, calculating, and he spoke with a tone that sent a chill down her spine. Maya, he said, his voice like ice. You're more than just a symbol. You're a tool we've been using to create the conditions for change. But now, you've outlived your usefulness. The public will decide who you really are. Whether you're the hero they thought you were, or the villain we made you. Maya took a step back, the reality of her situation hitting her all at once. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, used, manipulated, and discarded when she was no longer needed. Her chest tightened with a mix of anger and fear. Don't do this, she said, her voice trembling. But resolute. You've already done enough. The damage is done. You can't control what happens next. But they were already moving toward the door, their plan in place. Carter didn't even look at her as they left, the door closing behind them with a finality that felt suffocating. Maya stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process everything that had just happened. And then, as if the universe wasn't done with her yet, the final twist came. The monitors around her flickered to life. A new screen appeared, showing live footage of a large crowd gathered outside. The protests were still going strong, but this time, something was different. The faces of the protesters were clear, dozens of people, all wearing masks, all holding up signs. But as Maya's eyes scanned the crowd, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, at the front of the crowd, was a familiar face. The woman who had helped her escape earlier, the one who had promised to guide her through the darkness. She wasn't just there as an ally. She was holding a sign that read, Maya is the enemy. Maya's world tilted on its axis. The woman who had promised to protect her was now leading the charge against her. The lines between friend and foe, ally and enemy, had blurred beyond recognition. In that moment, Maya realized that this was far bigger than a fight for justice. It was a war for control, a war she had been dragged into, not by her own will, but by the strings of a puppet master she hadn't even known existed. And now, there was no going back.